song called I Can Only Imagine. Have you heard that song before? Will I stand? Will I be on the ground? Will I speak? Will I sing? Can I even speak at all? What's going to happen when I stand before the Father? And that's the word I bless you in Jesus' name that you take away today. So as we get into the passage, before we get into this particular portion of passage, let me just remind you of how Jesus lays this out in the Sermon on the Mount. Okay, this is Jesus' first recorded sermon. And let me just backtrack just a little bit. And what Jesus is trying to do with his first sermon is to take the people's understanding of the law, the standard of the law, and guess what? He wants to raise the standard. So people at that time thought, this is the law of God. Do not murder. Do not commit adultery. Do not do these things, X, Y, Z. And Jesus was coming and saying, well, yeah, that's the standard, but guess what? He raises the bar. So at that time, Pharisees were known to be the top of the law keepers. Does it make sense? Oh, those dudes, those guys, those Pharisees, they're keeping the law to the T. Man, that's the standard. If you can just be like the Pharisees, you're going to be righteous. You're going to earn your way and get into heaven. And Jesus comes and says, well, I'm going to take that bar of Pharisees and I'm going to make it higher. If your righteousness in Matthew chapter 5 does not surpass that of the Pharisees, you will certainly never, not, absolutely, will not, cannot, never enter the kingdom of heaven. So the listeners were like, what? Wait, hold on a second. We have to be higher than those guys? Like our righteousness has to surpass them? It's impossible. Jesus? His own disciples would also ask Jesus, Jesus, that's impossible. You're asking impossible. And that's exactly his point. You can't. You think, you have heard it said, you shall not murder, but if you have hatred, you've done it. The standard is, whoa, who hasn't called your brother a fool? You have heard it said, do not commit adultery, but if you have lust in your heart, you've already committed it. Dang, like, well, who's not, geez. And you had monks in the 1800s and 1900s who wear those things. The reason why they wear those cloaks, so they could look on the ground, and that's in the writings of those monks, so they wouldn't commit lust. Good luck with that. And it leads to other forms of incorrect application. But Jesus sets it so high. And he also comes in the Sermon on the Mount, and he's going to get here too as well in chapter 6, to correct the misuse of the law. So the law was being used to divide, you see, righteous, unrighteous. The law was being used to fulfill what people at that time wanted. The law concerning divorce. The way you have heard it said, and the way that it was being used through Old Testament custom and law was that men were able to, there were two main schools of that thought, right? Men, if they had any reason to divorce, they could. And just like, no, man, you guys are getting it wrong. But Moses said we could. No, Moses did it because your hearts were hardened. What God has put together, no one should tear apart. But you've turned it in to making it say what you want. An eye for an eye last week was a custom made for governmental law, but it was being used for vengeance. You took my son, I take your son. You take my eye, I take your eye. You see, you understand? And Jesus is teaching them, don't hold that vengeance in your heart. It's better to have no